Entree. The doors slid open. Ryla rose from the long, comfortable bench on the Macon Heights platform. Soft blues and pinks meeting in the sky above. She nodded at the engineer, who poked his head out, glancing each way for passengers running late or in need of assistance. The engineer raised a hand to another head poking out a few doors down, and grinned as he approached Ryla.
"Lovely day," he grinned. "Can I take that for you?"
He motioned to the bag on the bench as Ryla steadied herself on the walker. She nodded, and he hoisted it over his shoulder, waving at a group of children hopping up the side of the platform and racing to the train.
"Charlie's got a lemon pound cake today,"
he said, glancing down as Ryla's wheels cleared the tiny gap between the platform and door. The tiny chunk of the wheels gave way to the smooth swish of carpet as she glided towards the seats. Ryla found a cozy spot by the window, and the engineer placed her bag on the seat beside her. "Thank you, Ed," she said, glancing at his all-caps name tag. He chuckled.
"Don't forget about the pound cake. I know you have a fondness for the ginger cookies, but Charlie always has those."
He poked his head out the door once again, waving down the side of the train, hitting a button behind him as the doors whooshed shut. Ryla smiled at the couple across from her, the sides of their heads touching as they looked over a heavily creased map. At another window, a few children were chatting. The air tram started to hum, and the brick walls of the station slipped away. Ryla leaned back, looking out the window. She would never get tired of this journey, back and forth from the town to the city, being able to see the spaces between as they grew over with spring and would eventually fade to autumn colors. Brightly painted neighborhoods flashed past, connecting community gardens full of tomatoes and wildflowers, children wading through the waist-high growth of the season. Ryla was grateful for this commute. Variation 1. 20 years ago, this same journey would have been an hour and a half of solitary confinement, engine growling, exhaust fumes clinging to clothes. Back then, almost everyone had to learn how to drive. Those kids at the next window would have already been preparing. To see them crawling around on their seats or plastered to the window, it seemed absurd, the responsibility that used to be placed on them. 16-year-olds, barely out of adolescence, would grip the wheel of a 10-ton machine, taught to maneuver it through narrow streets. It was a rite of passage, a dance with danger. But now, as Ryla gazed out at the cityscape, she wondered if it had been intentional. The absurdity of it all struck Ryla, the way freedom had once meant isolation, and individualism had danced with subjugation. To be free and alone was not freedom, or at least it was a specific type for a specific few. The couple across from her turned their map, and Ryla smiled. On the back of their map was the city slogan, "Together on the right track." It had been adopted nearly a decade back to reflect the new vision, including public transit as a public good by and for the people. Another hydraulic door hissed, and Charlie, who ran the tea cart on Tuesdays and Thursdays, entered their compartment. Variation 2.
"Blessed again by the prima ballerina of Macon Heights," Charlie said,
stopping next to Ryla's seat, kicking the wheel lock on the cart and leaning up against the upholstery.
"How's the restoration coming along?"
Ryla smiled. "We keep finding more and more letters, inventions, diaries, and other strange things stuffed into the walls."
"Some things can't be buried," Ed said,
handing her a napkin.
"Innovation is one of those. Sprouts back up before you know it."
The Ford factory had been seized a few decades back, when Ryla was just leaving school and sat empty until she was able to convince the local government to restore it. It would be a community center where she would continue teaching dance. The center would also include a museum of labor rights. It had sat empty, falling apart for so long, and many people wanted it to fall apart, to forget what had happened there. "Ed talked up your lemon cake," Ryla said, turning toward Charlie, and saw the woman across from her dart her eyes up and over to the cart. Charlie smiled, slipping a plate off the cart stack. "One for you too?" Charlie asked the woman opposite, who glanced at the offering sign and held up 2 fingers. Charlie handed out the cakes, and the woman tapped her fingers to her chin in thanks. Charlie mirrored the gesture and continued down the aisle. Ryla thought back to her ASL classes in school, quickly running through the alphabet on her fingers out of habit. She glanced up the aisle, where the school children were now chatting with Charlie about the day's offerings. She inhaled, thinking about her grandparents. She lived in their ivy-covered home now, and her parents came out on weekends to visit. Before the rail system, her grandparents had been trapped out in the small town, relying on friends to shuttle them into the city for groceries. Ryla smiled and put her hand to the window. Her grandparents wouldn't have been able to imagine the life Ryla had now, and she couldn't imagine what would come for the generations after her. Coda. The couple had their plates on a shared tray that folded out from the seats. Ryla glanced out the window again. The painted houses and wildflowers had turned to high-rises, lush greenery pouring down from balconies, clotheslines swinging over the city. She could see the rooftop gardeners, probably pulling out the late summer spinach for the tenants below. It was only a few more minutes to the hub, where Ryla would meet her coworker Sven, who took the connecting bus with her. The train started to slow, and the school children rushed towards the door. She could hear Ed making jokes with the small crowd. As the doors slid open, the children pattered away, and Ryla rose, placing her bag on the walker's tray and the rest of the cake in her coat pocket. The couple across from her were signing with Ed, pointing at their map. Ryla waved to them as she left the train. It had rained in the city last night, and her wheels whirred over the saturated concrete. She saw Sven and his partner by the playground where the school children had gathered. At one point, the playground had been a 7,000-spot parking lot. When the grass had grown over, Sven's partner had spearheaded building the community playground so their children could have a place to gather and play with their commuter friends in the morning, before continuing to the school down the block. The city was quiet in the morning. Trains and buses were nearly silent, and all Ryla could hear around her was laughter.